try to get all the Canadians together.
You from Toronto.
I'm from Toronto, yeah. That's where I grew up. And I went to U of T. How about you?
I did all my school.
Okay,
I did a postdoc in West.
I see. That's how you ended up there.
So you've been here.
Since 2000. Okay, I'm being.
Oh, okay. Got it. Are we good to go now? Should we start?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the break. Lots of opportunities for networking, which is always a highlight of the BACWA annual meeting. So welcome back, everybody. My name is Eric Dunleavy. I am the BACWA board member representing the city of San Jose. We're going to start our nutrient session right now, which I assume is going to be a very popular session. As you all know, nutrients have dominated much of the work of BACWA for almost a decade, and certainly over the past year as we've been negotiating the reissuance of the nutrient watershed permit. This year, unlike previous years where we've had a session on update of the science from SFEI, we're going to skip that science update and instead target this session specifically to address the permit that the Water Board will consider at their June 12th hearing. A reminder to everybody, the watershed permit is out right now as a tentative order with comments due next Wednesday. So to start off this session, we'll first start with Tom Mumley, Assistant Executive Officer from the Water Board, who will frame the permitting discussion for us. Tom always gives a good big picture overview of issues, especially nutrients. Robert Slipf will follow Tom. Robert is also with the Water Board, and he'll walk us through the draft permit, also known right now as the tentative order. And then Richard Looker, also with the Water Board, will describe how the Water Board has established the final effluent limits in the draft permit. And then Lorian will wrap up our session with a description of BACWA's role in the watershed permit negotiations and in maintaining compliance with that permit once it is adopted. And I am not going to introduce each speaker separately. They're going to transition on their own. So I'm going to ask you to hold questions until we finish this session. And then we'll have a moderated Q&A to cover all of these topics. Thanks a lot. And Tom, please get us started.
Well, thank you. And here again, although sadly, as many of you know, this will likely be the last time I speak at this meeting as a Water Board employee, as I'm on the cusp of retiring. I committed to stay on to at least getting this permit across the finish line, but I ain't going away, as many of you know. I just still have too much fun in being involved in policy and science work, and I intend to keep participating in one form or another. So I'll maybe be back at future meetings, just being Tom Mumley, interested member of the public who wants to help BACWA, and you all do as best you can to protect our bay, which you do well, by the way. Okay, so I just quickly want to set the stage. This is a slide I showed last year, that when we went from, because of the game changer, the 2022 algal bloom was, and we went from the focus of the third watershed permit being from some form of load cap to, we said we now have to consider load reduction, and the big question was how much by when? And so that's just want to emphasize that. And then, so this just summarizes sort of where we've got to. You all know we have a permit on the street with the proposed Bay-wide, 40% load reduction relative to 2022. But also, but because we have to include individual limits just for procedural reasons, they're there, but the individual limits are secondary. I really want to emphasize the benefit of what we created, the Bay-wide approach, and it's couple reasons for that. One is that it continues to promote and facilitate looking at a Bay-wide approach towards managing wastewater. And there's, in the future, because we need more and more of that, we can't just do it individually. We're going to have to do it more collectively. And there's going to be more challenging issues ahead that will be benefited from the lessons we're learning from taking this regional approach. The other point is, we don't want to have to. We don't expect to have to enforce those individual limits because we're optimistic about the ability to attain current or future Bay-wide approach or some alternative that would come through reissuance. But I just want to remind you, I pretty much respect the angst generated by the individual limits because founded on no one wants to be in non-compliance. But worst case scenario, mind you, worst case scenario, if we had to enforce individual limits, they would be, it's very unlikely, perhaps next to nil, that we would exercise discretionary enforcement against anybody who is a good actor. And as far as an MMP, mandatory minimum penalty, you would have to exceed your individual limit by 40% in order to incur a once a year $3,000 penalty. So think about that, put the angst towards working with us as how we make this permit work and how we can make informed adaptations to it. We're currently constrained by state policy to limit the compliance schedule to 10 years, but there will be future opportunity to do so, to revisit that. We know we're going to advance the science. We know we're going to make progress on what can be done by whom, where, in what time frame. So we'll have the ability, a foundation for revisiting, and in the confines of the existing state policy, we can do an updated interpretation of the appropriate standard and provide more time. And we've already stated clearly opportunity to demonstrate preference for multi-benefit solutions, knowing that many of them will take longer than 10 years because of the nature of building those solutions, whether they be recycled water projects or nature-based solutions. And so I just want to end with this overview is that I did say last year that in the consideration of the nutrient load limits, we would look for this balance between what you all can do versus what the science advises us in terms of what the Bay needs. And I guarantee we've strove to find that balance, do the best we can to recognize early actors, the reality of what it's going to take to meet the infrastructure improvements in a smart way. So my view is we've done a decent job. I know a year ago, I told you all that we're going to push you into your zone of discomfort. And as Amit said, success, right? So, ting, so we, I like following up on my commitments. So, but I'm really confident that with your commitment to enhance your implementation, your planning for more implementation, in conjunction with improvements to the science, we're going to be in a position to make this work smartly, collaboratively, and cost effectively. So with that, I'm going to call on my team to explain what the overview of what we actually have in the permit. So Robert, you're first. Oops.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Robert Schliff. I'm a senior engineer in the NPDES wastewater division, and along with my colleague Richard Looker, we're going to be doing a walkthrough of the draft nutrient watershed permit. So to start out, I wanted to present some background information on how we've been regulating nutrients over the past 10 years, talk a little bit about the algae bloom that occurred in 2022, explain how nutrients fueled this bloom, describe the need to reduce nitrogen levels in San Francisco Bay, and then go into how we plan to regulate nutrients from wastewater treatment plants. And then along the way, we'll talk about all the considerations that went into that process. So with regards to nitrogen loadings to the bay, we've been asking these management questions for about 10 years now. Do nutrient loads result in adverse impacts now or under future scenarios? And what management actions will prevent or mitigate current or future impacts? And we've had time to ask these management questions because historically, San Francisco Bay has been really resistant to high nutrient loadings. And that's because the nutrients aren't used. And many of you have probably seen this many times before. And it's for these three reasons. The bay has high suspended sediment concentrations that limit light penetration. It has strong tidal mixing that limits periods of stratification. And it has filter feeding clams that eat up algae and keep their populations low. So for these reasons, the nutrient watershed permits that we issued in 2014 and 2019, they did not include nutrient limits from discharges from POTWs. Instead, we really focused on characterizing nutrient loads to the bay, doing a bunch of receiving water monitoring, developing models to see the bay's impact from current or increased nutrient loadings. And if reductions were going to become necessary, we had POTWs study what sort of options were available to them. So in general, this was really about improving our scientific understanding. Now, things changed significantly in the summer of 2022 when the conditions that I just mentioned, they were no longer present to limit algae growth. And there was a very large algae bloom, Heterosigma akashiwo, and it formed near the Bay Bridge, and it spread to the lower bay and South Bay, and it consumed all the available nitrogen, and it resulted in thousands of dead fish and extremely low dissolved oxygen levels over a very large area. And on the left-hand side of this screen, you're just seeing the giant bloom below the Bay Bridge, and then the right-hand side is just showing thousands of dead fish from Lake Merritt. So this means that we need to change our approach when we issue the third nutrient watershed permit. So I wanted to briefly describe some of the key tenets in the third watershed permit and talk about the significant changes that we're making, why we're making those changes, and some of the policies that guide our implementation. So first, as with the first two watershed permits, POTWs will be required to monitor nutrient loadings to the bay and submit this annual report that analyzes their trends. They'll also be required to continue funding the science program at $2.2 million per year. And this is to ensure that we're collecting adequate receiving water information and also to develop the model of the bay to evaluate how it assimilates nutrients under a changing climate. Now, by far, the most significant change with this permit reissuance is that it will include interim limits to ensure performance does not degrade, and final limits that will require substantial load reductions to ensure beneficial uses are protected. And then there's a requirement to report on actions and progress that's being taken to meet these final limits. And most of this presentation is really going to focus on how we developed final limits for nitrogen. And then finally, the last key tenet has to do with regional planning to ensure there's coordination to implement these reductions as soon as possible. And then also identifying options for multi-benefit solutions for nutrient reduction. So because of the algae bloom that occurred in 2022, there's reasonable potential for POTWs to discharge nitrogen at levels that could cause or contribute to an exceedance of the narrative biostimulatory substances objective. And when the Water Board makes a finding of reasonable potential, we have to include effluent limits that are protective of water quality. And so what this slide is showing is under the Code of Federal Regulations, you really have three options to develop these effluent limits if you don't have a numeric water quality objective. So for San Francisco Bay, there are no US EPA criteria guidance under Clean Water Act Section 304A that are applicable. So that first bullet is not an option. And here we also want to regulate the pollutant of concern, total inorganic nitrogen. So it's not really possible to use an indicator parameter. So we are left with the third bullet, and that is what we're going to do. We're going to use a we're going to use a calculated numeric criterion to interpret the narrative objective. So what we're going to do is use objectives for dissolved oxygen along with supplemental information to interpret that narrative objective and figure out what nitrogen loading is protective of beneficial uses. And I'm going to hand it over to Richard to do this portion of the presentation.
I was so mesmerized by, I didn't know it was my turn. Okay. I was just thinking, like, when Eileen said that she started in July of 2022, like, it was so nice of us to arrange this algae bloom for you as your first thing to work on. So, okay, thanks, Robert. So my job for this part of the presentation is to explain how we developed a quantitative relationship between the nitrogen loading from wastewater facilities and the dissolved oxygen level in San Francisco Bay, and then how we use that quantitative relationship to figure out what would be the necessary load reductions to achieve that narrative water quality objective, translated through dissolved oxygen. And we're using the bloom of 2022 as the so-called critical condition as like the framework for this analysis. And what that means is that we want to try to understand as much as we can the features, the mechanics of how the bloom operated in terms of utilization of nitrogen, and then hopefully like play what if scenarios so that if we were to get those just right conditions for another bloom to happen, if we had reduced nitrogen loads, we would be able to ameliorate the impact of a bloom like that enough so that we could achieve this water quality objective and protect beneficial uses. So that's sort of like the theme, or the how we're approaching developing the effluent limitations. So I think it's good to begin with sort of reviewing what happened during the algae bloom. And I've got, I worked with the animators from South Park to develop some sophisticated animations for you. And there's 3 characters for the animations. There's nitrogen, that's represented by a big red N. There's oxygen, and nitrogen was the fuel for the algae bloom. And then oxygen is a blue O, which is critical for aquatic life, and it was reduced at the end of the bloom. And then I've got this expert sketch of Heterosigma akashio, the harmful algal species involved. Okay, so at the beginning of the bloom, like imagine you're underwater. I told you that it's high tech. You're underwater, you're looking at a cross section of the bay, and you've got plenty of nitrogen, you've got enough oxygen to support aquatic life, but you've got these Heterosigma akashios kind of lurking. The sediments are at the bottom, and there's the water. Now, normally this is not a problem, as Robert said, that this is kind of the condition all the time in the summer. We've got plenty of nitrogen. We've got harmful algal species, not just this one, but others that exist. And things don't go off the rails because of those factors that Robert mentioned. There's mixing that doesn't allow an organism like this to stay in the photic zone long enough to do mischief. There's grazing from zooplankton and bivalves, and there's turbidity that limits the light. So these organisms can't grow fast enough to overcome those things, so they can't utilize all of the nitrogen. But something went wrong in 2022 where conditions were just right where that did happen. And so what happened in summer of 2022 was that the Heterosigma akashio used basically all of the nitrogen and grew to big abundance. And a couple of points that I'll come back to that are kind of critical for our analysis is that basically all of the nitrogen in the water got used. So when the scientists of the nutrient management strategy, they went out to measure nitrogen, it was at or below detection limit. So it was basically all used. And when they measured the chlorophyll A concentrations and then were able to convert that to biomass, it basically penciled out in round numbers where the biomass that was produced could be accounted for by complete utilization of the nitrogen. So all of the nitrogen that was available at the beginning of the bloom, and then ongoing inputs, basically went into production of this organism. So it was it used everything. It ate everything available. And so then finally the algae die. They kind of sink to the bottom, and they get consumed by bacteria. That process consumes oxygen, and the oxygen fell to quite low levels, at least temporarily, like for a short period of time. And that harmed aquatic life. There were fish kills, and there's some of the fish kill could have been attributed to the toxins that the organism produces, but also dissolved oxygen got drawn down low enough to account for some of that as well. Okay, so then the take-home message from the bloom was that there was plenty of nitrogen available for these bloom conditions to provide ample fuel for the algae growth, and there was so much kind of messed up on the animation here. Okay, so let me start this one over. So then the current nitrogen loads were sufficient to produce enough algae that once that algae was consumed by bacteria, it was able to bring oxygen down to a low level that could harm aquatic life. So what we want to do for the permit is we want to reduce nitrogen loads such that the concentrations of algae that could be possibly produced by those reduced loads would still leave enough oxygen in the water to protect aquatic life and meet that narrative objective that Robert spoke to. So the first question we have to ask is how much oxygen is enough in the water to protect aquatic life? And so thinking back to what happened in the aftermath of the bloom when the algae crashed, the oxygen was drawn down to low levels, a couple milligrams per liter, but it was just for a short period of time. It was maybe like a couple of days, and then oxygen was resupplied through mixing processes and kind of reabsorption from oxygen in the atmosphere. So it didn't stay down too long. So there was an acute exposure of aquatic life to this low oxygen condition, not a chronic exposure. And so since we're using the algae bloom as our critical condition to develop the permitting strategy, what we want is we want an oxygen endpoint that protects against an acute exposure for aquatic life. And the EPA has produced a method for doing that for both acute and chronic dissolved oxygen endpoints. It's called the Virginia Province approach. And we have used this very approach to compute both acute and chronic objectives that we use that were developed in Sassoon Marsh. So we've used it there. We're also using this same method to compute oxygen endpoints for sloughs in South San Francisco Bay. And so the way the method works is that you decide what species are relevant for the environment that you're concerned about, for which you're computing the endpoints. Which of those species have dissolved oxygen laboratory data that you can use for the calculation. And then you collect all that together, and for the acute endpoint, the calculation is driven by the dissolved oxygen sensitivity of the 4 most sensitive species. And you run some numbers and some statistics, and out pops the number. And so the 4 most sensitive species for the Sassoon Marsh project are shown on this slide. And the 4 most sensitive species for the Lower South Bay sloughs were different, but there's overlap. They also include sturgeon. So, but the interesting thing was, in both cases, the acute number came out to a little bit below 4 milligrams per liter. And so we think, and we're pretty confident that the sensitive species that were driving the calculation for these 2 projects represent the sensitive species for San Francisco Bay. There's not, to my knowledge, like something else lurking out there for which there's data that's more sensitive. And so we think 4 milligrams per liter is the appropriate acute endpoint that we can use when we're targeting like how much load reduction is necessary. So that's that. The next thing we have to consider is like how much of the bay can fall below 4 milligrams per liter and still protect aquatic life. And so the US EPA recognizes that beneficial uses can be protected even if objectives are not met 100% of the time. And there's even US EPA guidance that's used by a lot of the states, including California, that for something like dissolved oxygen, you can have up to a 10% exceedance frequency and still protect aquatic life. So we don't have a way to think about exceedance frequency in terms of like a temporal dimension, because again, we're just using this algae bloom. It was one event. We don't really know now like how frequently an event like this can happen. So what we're doing is we're kind of substituting space for time. So what we're saying is we want no more than 10% of each segment of the bay, like shown here on the slide, to fall below that 4 milligrams per liter acute metric. So in other words, we want at least 4 milligrams per liter in 90% of the area of all of these segments, even if there was kind of a repeat of an algae bloom, but we want it to be kind of less severe in this way. So now that we have our desired DO condition, we need to find a loading level for wastewater that allows us to have 90% of each segment of the bay have at least 4 milligrams per liter, even if we had an algae bloom. So before I get into that and to show you how we did it, I need to explain two chemistry concepts. And like thinking about these chemistry concepts, but before I was talking today, I was thinking, this is the wrong audience for this. Like this is gonna seem like really basic, trivial information for you, but they're in the presentation, and so away we go. So the first chemistry concept is like we know the chemical composition of algae. So like most living things, the chemical composition is mainly carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So there's other things, of course, but these, for our purposes, we can focus on this. And this ratio is called the Redfield ratio. And if you looked at the elemental composition of algae, you would find this ratio of like about 106 carbon atoms to 16 nitrogen atoms to 1 phosphorus atom. So notice that the ratio of carbon to nitrogen is 106 to 16, or 6.6 carbons per nitrogen. And so that is handy because remember that we had the observation that all of the nitrogen in the water was turned into phytoplankton. So we can take the amount of nitrogen in the water and multiply it by this ratio from the Redfield ratio, and we can compute the amount of carbon that we would find in the phytoplankton if they utilized all of the nitrogen available in the water. So that is useful chemistry fact number one. And chemistry fact number two is that we know that when dead algae get decomposed, a certain amount of oxygen is required for the decomposition. This is like big news for like a wastewater crowd, but here we go. And so we know that for each carbon in the dead algae, it requires 1 molecule of oxygen, which contains 2 atoms for the decomposition, and you get 1 molecule of carbon dioxide at the end. So this is useful because once we are able to, we can compute the amount of carbon that's in the water from complete utilization of the nitrogen, and this is the way that we can compute how much oxygen is required. Is kind of like the debt that you got to pay to digest all of that dead algae at the end of the bloom. So now we're in a position to kind of show you like the modeling of how we put it all together. So the nutrient management strategy, they've developed a model that takes all of the nitrogen inputs from the POTWs and other sources, applies the relevant mixing processes from tides and winds and currents, the relevant chemistry processes like denitrification and such, and also sort of like the non-bloom algae utilization of the nitrogen. So, and this is a well-calibrated model that matches observations really well. So what we get out of this is a field, a three-dimensional field of nitrogen, like in grid cells all over the bay. And so we can run that model up to the point of just before the algae bloom, like in July of 2022. And then we take that ratio from the Redfield ratio, applied grid cell by grid cell to all of the nitrogen that was computed, multiply by basically 6.6, and we can get the amount of carbon that would be in the phytoplankton that would completely utilize that nitrogen that was predicted by the model. And then we know how much oxygen would need to be taken out of the water to completely digest that algae once it was dead. And then we would subtract that from the starting point oxygen in the water, and then we can compute or estimate the amount of oxygen left in the water after the complete digestion of the algae produced from the nitrogen. And the figure on the right, notice the color scale, that blue or cooler colors like blue or green indicate a higher dissolved oxygen, and when it's lower, it's going to be colored like red or orange. So then playing around with this model, you model like the base case of loads of what they actually were in 2022, and you can see that you've got pretty widespread areas of low dissolved oxygen in the lower part of the bay, a lot of red and orange. So then you turn down the wastewater loads a little bit and you improve it. You get a little bit more blue and green, so oxygen is better. And then finally, if you reduce loads even more, you can improve the conditions even more. So having a model like this to get the, you can kind of play what if scenarios for the load reductions needed. And so the final analysis was, when we looked at the results, we found that a 40% load reductions from the 2022 baseline would reduce nitrogen in the bay enough so that even if all of that nitrogen was turned into phytoplankton like it was during the 2022 bloom, we would still retain enough oxygen in the water to have at least 4 milligrams per liter in at least 90% of every part of the bay. So that's, that 40% met the mark in terms of our desired dissolved oxygen condition that we have associated with achievement of that narrative objective. So that is sort of like the science behind how we computed the scale of the load reductions necessary. Now I'm going to hand it back to Robert to sort of go through the remaining particulars of the effluent limits that we would compute.
Hey, thank you, Richard. So what this slide is showing, there's a bar chart. So you can see in 2022, loads to the bay from all the POTWs was 44,400 kilograms per day during the summer months. And to achieve the 40% reduction that's protective of beneficial uses, the aggregate load would need to be 26,700 kilograms per day. Now, as Tom said earlier, we're taking a bay-wide approach to compliance. So as long as this overall load is met, then every facility would be in compliance. Now, if it's not met, individual facilities that don't meet their individual limits would be found in violation. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we calculated limits for each facility. We ended up just using two categories. So for minor dischargers, we based limits on past loadings. And this is just because they only contribute about 0.1% of the nitrogen loading to the bay. And then for everyone else, the major dischargers, final limits are based on a nitrogen concentration of 20.5 milligrams per liter in 2022 flows. And if you do that, it equates to an overall load reduction of 40%. Now, these limits don't become effective immediately. Obviously, we recognize that treatment plant improvements need to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about the State Water Board's compliance schedule policy next. So in 2008, the State Water Board adopted a compliance schedule policy for NPDES permits. And this policy says that regional water boards can allow a maximum of up to 10 years in a permit if we're doing a new interpretation of a narrative water quality objective. And that is exactly what the nutrient watershed permit is doing. And because we recognize that treatment upgrades across the Bay Area will take a very long time, we are granting the maximum of 10 years. Now, when you're granting a compliance schedule longer than a year, the compliance schedule policy also has prescriptive requirements that need to be included in the permit. First, you have to include interim limits that are based on current treatment performance. Second, you have to have interim requirements that have milestones and require reporting from dischargers to ensure they're making progress to meet the final limits. And then finally, you need to have the final limits that are protective of beneficial uses. And these three elements are all included in the tentative order. And I do want to point out that the final limits will not become effective far beyond the next permit reissuance, so we will have the opportunity to reevaluate those final limits in 5 years. So now that I've covered how we developed limits and offered a compliance schedule to attain them, I want to briefly touch on the fourth tenet of the nutrient watershed permit, which centers around regional planning and multi-benefit solutions. So for regional planning, we want to ensure dischargers work together and coordinate to implement the projects as soon as possible. We also want them to identify how further reductions in nitrogen loadings beyond those required by this order could be achieved through water recycling and nature-based solutions. And if a facility is proposing like a very large recycled water project to meet the final limits in this order, we want them to identify that and report it to us, because we're going to use whatever regulatory mechanisms we have to extend the compliance schedule for those types of facilities. And then finally, we also want agencies to develop a more formal nutrient trading program. We think that this will be necessary to have effective before final limits come into play, or at least beneficial. So as for the timeline, comments are due on May 8th, so next Wednesday. We'll be preparing a draft response to comments that we will provide to all the commenters in late May and June prior to bringing this item before our board on June 12th. And I will stop there. Can I give this to you, Eric? Or?
So I'm the last one, and then you'll have a chance for comment or questions and comments. All right. So I'm just picking up where Robert left off. I had the benefit of seeing the water board slides, so I was able to do the seamless segue. Someone at your agency has a copy of the draft BACWA comment letter in their email inbox, since I sent it out to everybody who received the watershed permit tentative order from Robert. So you have the opportunity to review and comment on it. We're taking edits until close of business on Monday, so I know that the time is short. We also are encouraging member agencies to submit their own comment letters. So BACWA, we've worked hard to capture some of the texture of how this watershed permit is going to impact our members, but we can't know everything, so this is an important opportunity to express to the board what this permit means for your agency. So this is picking up where we left off last year. So our vision is to reduce nutrients sustainably on a regional basis while implementing projects that maximize benefits and balance competing priorities. We're not unique in that. This is the Water Board's vision as well, and other stakeholders such as Baykeeper in the region. We all have different ideas about what the permit should look like to implement that, but we all have the same goals. As Amit said when we came in, we are all on the same team. And the Water Board has been listening to us when we've expressed our concerns about how this vision is or is not supported by the watershed permit. So it turns out that the NPDES permit structure isn't really built to supply the flexibility we need even in the watershed permit structure. One of the major culprits, as Robert mentioned, is the 2008 state compliance schedule policy that really constrains our timeline to a maximum of 10 years. And of course, we know that we need more than 10 years to plan and implement recycled water and nature-based solutions, to plan out financing. So we know that the reductions associated with this permit, if we go with conventional upgrades, are going to be in the region of $11 billion. I feel like Dr. Evil, $11 billion. And that means about $250 per household in our region per year, which for some is pocket change, but for others is going to make the difference between whether they can buy medication or spend their money on their utility bills. We need to phase projects to reduce competition for contractors and financing and reduce regional costs. So you heard from Karen earlier that already before all of this goes down, the state revolving fund is oversubscribed by a factor of 2 right now, and nobody's riding to our rescue with grant funding yet. We're just starting out on a mission to educate our legislators on the need for attracting funding to our region. Peter showed the grant funding, not grant funding, the money that's flowing to WIFIA from EPA as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's a lot less zeros on it than what our needs are here right now. We need time to pilot innovative treatment technologies. I know that there's several folks in this room that are embarking on that right now with EPA funding, actually. And then we need to balance competing capital priorities. I've heard from many agencies that you're already in the middle of a big construction project or about to embark on one for other reasons. I'm going to quote Eileen from A Different Life. A lot of agencies, are embarking on rebuilding and seismic upgrades, and so nutrient reduction needs to be built into that. And then, the science is still developing this. I thought, Robert, you did an excellent job explaining how you use this back-of-the-envelope approach or Richard, not Robert, to develop the limits, but there's going to be more science coming in the next years to support a more nuanced approach, and we're going to need to be able to adaptively manage to that. And by the way, that animation of the oxygens coming to take carbon from the dead algae was brilliant. I want to use that. I think the South Park animators would be jealous of that. So this isn't news. They're not hearing this from us for the first time. And so you'll notice that in the tentative order there is language that acknowledges these limitations, and then also commits to looking for ways in future permits to address these time issues. So these are the 3 options that are outlined in the tentative order. So first of all, there's time schedule orders or cease and desist orders. This is what Tom was talking about, a friendly enforcement action. So, that's obviously not our preferred approach. It's going to be a tough sell to convince boards to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on multi-benefit projects only to be served an enforcement order, even if it's a friendly enforcement order. For number 2, reduce final limits and future permits to restart clock. So we all understand that future permit limits are going to be based on the science, and they might change from what we see right now, but it's tough to swallow that when figuring out what to plan for in our capital programs. Although I would say that a wise capital program will incorporate the possibility of future lower limits. So number 3 is the most attractive for us anyways. But depending on how it's approached, it's definitely labor intensive for the water board, and it comes with some uncertainties depending on the scope of the basin plan amendment. So regardless of whether the water board chooses to do this or not, that's not something that they are going to be doing before the permit is adopted. So number 4 wasn't mentioned in the permit, but I do want to call this out. It's amending the compliance schedule policy at the statewide level and scoping out how feasible that is. And so this isn't something that we can deal with within our region. It's something that we would need to go to the state to advocate for, and it would involve many more stakeholders on a statewide level. So basically, we understand the Water Board's legal constraints and will need to work with the Water Board after the permit's adopted. This isn't the finish line, and we want to support the strategic phased regional approach that we all agree is the way to go. So, permit gets adopted on June 12th, hopefully with a few changes that we're recommending in our comment letter. What's that going to look like next for our agencies, and how can BACWA assist in watershed permit compliance? So, first of all, we intend to provide a summary of the permit and the reporting requirements after its adoption. If you've read through those reporting requirements, it's quite a bit more extensive than what is in our current permit in terms of showing progress in terms of reportable milestones. So we hope to figure out how to streamline that. And the nature of those milestones is something that we're discussing with Robert and his team offline, because we understand we certainly don't want everybody to have to go to bid on the same day in 2028, I think it is, because that's obviously going to drive up costs. So we're going to think about how to get the Water Board what they need in terms of reportable milestones in a way that makes more sense for our agencies. So after the permit's adopted, BACWA will continue to provide the group annual report as we have so far. We plan to issue an RFP later this year for consultant support for the regional planning study that's required. We'll be continued to provide representation and work with the science program to provide enhanced reporting so that agencies understand where their science funding is going. And I also do want to call out that with that science funding, which comes from our agencies via the nutrient surcharge, it looks like there's going to be a pretty large EPA match that comes with that. So they're really going to be able to leverage that funding to expand and accelerate the science program. So exciting times ahead. I've shown something like this before. This is just 2023 numbers. I've shown an average before. This is the cumulative contribution of TIN loading from each agency. And the purpose of this, if you recall, was to show that there's a few large agencies that do contribute the lion's share, but no individual agency can take care of this on their own. And most agencies, if you look at the proportion you contribute, it's fairly small, but there's a lot of fairly small agencies, which means the big agencies can't do it alone. But there are definitely some agencies here as you get towards the tail that are, in fact, de minimis. Economies of scale say that it doesn't make sense for many of these agencies to embark on major upgrades, which will cost millions and not make any difference. At the same time, there are equity issues if, the economic burden is placed on ratepayers in Hunters Point or West Oakland, who are part of large agencies, are subsidizing folks who are in, say, Tiburon, for example. That doesn't make sense on a regional level, and that's where the trading program comes in. So the tentative order allows and encourages a trading program to provide more cost-effective compliance. So it's our plan to scope out and look for funding to support a trading framework that'll improve regional flexibility. So it would provide options for some of the very small agencies, like if you discharge a few dozen kilograms of nutrients per day, it should be fairly easy to find credits for that. But also some of the larger agencies that are close to their limit. So if your limit is 2,000, for example, and you discharge 2,100 on average that year, you'd be able to buy credits for that extra 100 rather than implementing a massive new upgrade project to take that off if you could find a trading partner. And it also provides a revenue source for agencies who perform better than their limits. So that's an advantage towards planning for a project that gets you better than what you're required to do. So this is one of those things, working towards a trading framework that we might be able to get EPA funding to support, and that's one of the elements we'll be talking with Louisa about at our June board meeting. And that's all for my presentation. I'm going to open it up now for questions for the entire panel.
So I want to thank all of our speakers. Round of applause before we go into questions. And I have to say, Richard, I appreciated your animations as well. I think Matt Stone and Trey Parker are very proud of you. Yeah. Again, thanks for the presentations. We'll now get to questions. I'm sure you have a lot of them for our panel. I do want to remind everybody and caution that because this is a pending action before the Water Board, they may be somewhat constrained in exactly what they can communicate. But with that, I'd like to welcome any questions.
Can you?
My background is not in the chemistry, so consider this as a dumb question. When you look at the nitrogen and oxygen, what we're trying to do is preserve the oxygen or dissolve the oxygen for the aquatic life. Instead of focusing on nitrogen, is there any way to increase that oxygen instead of reducing the nitrogen to maintain that dissolved oxygen in the bay? What I'm alluding to is by aerators or some sort of mechanism that can introduce dissolved oxygen into the bay. And again, this could be something different approach, but we do this all the time. And maybe it can be done for much less than $11 billion.
It's an interesting idea. I think so. The oxygen that first of all, like right before the crash, oxygen actually gets super saturated, and so it's it gets up saturation. I don't know. It might be like 8-9-ish milligrams per liter, and in some parts of the bay, it got up to like 15 milligrams per liter. So there was so much photosynthesis, and it super saturated the oxygen. And then you've got this huge BOD problem when the algae dies. So you've got this huge amount of carbon that's sitting out there that needs to be consumed, and the oxygen demand from the digestion of that carbon just overwhelms the natural processes for resupplying oxygen. So that's why it crashes. And so I think if you were to get together with some engineers and calculate like what it would take to put aerators throughout this, like, think about like how big San Francisco Bay is, even just like South Bay, and like what you would need to do to supply enough oxygen to meet that BOD, like and keep it going for a couple of days and find the power to do it and deploy the diffusers to be able to supply that oxygen. I think that you would be able to convince yourself that it's not a practical solution. They actually do that. Like, it's not a crazy idea, like in the sense, but like this is actually what they do, or they did do in the Thames River, is that they had a barge that would they would have monitoring of low oxygen, and they would send this barge and supply oxygen like to where they needed it. But that's a river, and it was like a little low DO hotspot, and so it was kind of in the realm of practicality. But supplying that much oxygen for a region like San Francisco Bay, or a big part of it, is just not going to be practicable. So it's so that's one thing. And then oxygen is not the only problem. So when you have an algae bloom like that, a large part of the problem could actually be coming from the toxins that are produced by the algae. So even if you were able to ameliorate just the dissolved oxygen impact of an algae bloom, that you're not going to be out of the woods in terms of the beneficial use impact.
So, Dan Jackson over on the left, I think.
Well, it's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have more to say, Robert?
I just wanted to add one small thing to your question. That was actually experimented with in some of the former salt ponds that are being restored. So they're managed ponds, and they often just grow a lot of algae and have dissolved oxygen problems. So 15 or 20 years ago, they put out a bunch of solar aerators to try and mitigate that. And even over that small scale, it like maybe improved dissolved oxygen from 0 to 1. It just wasn't effective. So
Dan, go ahead.
My question is very simple. Is the regional board okay with a trading program that's bay-wide and doesn't involve being constrained into particular bay segments?
Maybe. But to elaborate, we'll have, that's part of the dialogue. We put it this way: the permit, as proposed, would allow it, because the permit, as proposed, says if the bay-wide load reduction is 40%, everybody's in compliance. You don't have to even do any trading formally, as long as the net result of everybody's action. I mean, I think you all want trading more than we need it, because all we need is the result. What you need is a mechanism to do cost sharing, to do load sharing. And so we need, obviously there's some need to formalize that because of the legalities of who does what and challenges of how can districts exchange money. That in and of itself is something that's probably long overdue. But likely, bear in mind, in the future, we will at least consider revisit the Bay-wide approach, and a likely outcome and reconsideration is a North Bay approach versus a South Bay approach. So that's something we just have to keep in mind. But again, right now, according to what we proposed, there would be no constraint on that. But we have to just be wary that in the future, with more improved science and what parts of the bay really are more susceptible or vulnerable to HABs, we may have to constrain what can be traded relative to allowing protection of the bay. We are going to avoid any inference that this is pollution trading that the environmental NGOs hate. It's not like you can't pay to pollute. This is all about the optimum solution that results in protecting the bay. In that context, we're going to have plenty of opportunity to work out your question in a smart way so that we won't be caught up in legal or political constraints associated with what is exchanged or traded.
Thank you very much. I'm Nitin Goyal from Central SAN, and first and foremost, a great presentation, and the animations were so good. Shows that a complex topic can be explained so well. I'll show to my daughter today, so she's also gonna get insights on that. So a couple of questions. The first one is that, and I'm late in the game, I'm not kind of like attended all the BACWA annual meetings in the past. So you can consider this question kind of like coming from a novice. First one is that how confident the regional board and the scientific community is if we basically do this 40% reduction bay-wide and spending like, let's say, $11 billion plus, it will actually result in no or almost no fish kill. I think that's what probably the objective is, or basically keeping the DO where it is. That's one. And the second one is, I think the graph that you were showing, it was showing that there's a background concentration in the bay from the Suisun Bay to the South Bay. There's a different background nitrogen concentrations. So wondering whether a thought has been given on different effluent limits for considering where the treatment plants are located.
I'll take the first one, you take the second. So the first question is about confidence. I would encourage you, so I wrote a memo on, more elaborate, more detailed, basically about, the things that I presented today. There's a memo available that goes more in depth about how the modeling was done that's available, and both discuss uncertainties. So there are uncertainties. So your particular question is like, how confident are we about could we eliminate fish kills? So I would say that if we get an algae bloom that has the same features as the last one, close enough, and we are able to achieve the nitrogen concentrations at the beginning of the bloom that are consistent with that 40% load reduction, and there's complete utilization of the nitrogen, I think that the oxygen field after the decomposition of that algae will probably be okay. It'll be keeping oxygen up in the 4 milligram per liter range, and so that should not lead to fish kills vis-a-vis oxygen. The elephant in the room is and we're honest about it, that we don't currently have a way to relate the algae concentration to the toxin production, because there's a lot of unknowns and complications about the circumstances which lead to toxin production. So there is a possibility of problems with fish kills if you get like a bad bloom, even if you protect it against oxygen. But what I would also say is that you're getting a twofer when you reduce the nitrogen loads, because by reducing the nitrogen loads, you're reducing the potential for the algae growth. So you are lowering, substantially the risk of the toxin production, because you're lowering that amount of algae that could be produced. It's just that we don't have the know-how right now to calculate like what that is a priori. So it'll help, but we don't know to what extent. So then the question about background concentrations related to effluent limitation.
Sure. So when we decided to calculate the effluent limits, we were more taking an equity approach, where we wanted it to be the same concentration discharged from each facility. And that's in part because there was also a pretty significant bloom in San Pablo Bay in 2023 that we didn't talk about. And some of the assumptions that Richard went over, we're not considering toxins in the endpoint. And the 40%, we really kind of view that the minimum bay-wide that we need to do at this point.
And Mariana over on the left.
Work with us. No, I'm serious because you know, I would put on the table what we've done is eloquent considering the complications here. We've got a framework that's legally okay, but it gives us some ability to adapt. We know we're going to learn more about the science. We know lower South Bay, south of Dunbar Bridge, is super enriched, but how vulnerable is that for a HAB is a question that we need to explore further. There's a number of scientific questions that we're now able to articulate better than before, and our science program is going to be more focused on answering those questions in parallel with the challenge that we've imposed on, or proposing to impose on all you, to continue early implementation, advancing implementation, and planning. So you want to have sort of like, okay, are we ready to push the button? Or by working with us, by communicating your commitment and your progress, which is what's an important part of the permit, is paying attention to meeting those milestones, and so we're well aware of things because we all want to do the right thing, right? We all want to do the right thing, and so we don't want to regret having made the wrong decision, et cetera, et cetera. Since I get the mic, there's a couple things that do come to mind along that line, because you know, there are other things that we're going to also have to be aware of, and you know another I don't know, it's an elephant in the room that we have to be aware of are the PFAS. Because you know, we're hopeful that we're going to be able to fend off the need for limits for the foreseeable future, but there's going to be regulatory decisions that we don't have direct control over that may result in a need to force treatment actions for PFAS. I'm going to forecast we're not going to solve the problem through source control. There are so many of them, and there's already a legacy that there's going to be some form of challenge that we're going to have to operate on. And that's just another layer on top of what you already are challenged with. What technologies, if you're going to improve your plant, would have both a nutrient load reduction benefit as well as a PFAS and other emerging contaminant benefits. That's why we're very hopeful about some of the nature-based solutions or even the recycled water solutions that if you're going to go to advanced treatment, we might, you know, it's going to make recycled water more relevant than just going to advanced treatment to put water into the bay. And fortunately, some of the experiments regarding nature-based solutions, particularly for managing reverse osmosis concentrate at the Oraloma test facility, is looking very promising. But one thing this may be the opportunity I wanted to say something. Most of you remember Jim Kelly from Central San, and I remember he approached me. It was like somewhere in the 2012 arena. It was just after the Central Valley Board took an action imposing limits on Sac Regional, and then forcing them to do a substantial upgrade in a relatively short period of time. And they spent close to $2 billion. Jim came to me and says, "Tom, are you guys going to do the same thing to us?" And my answer at the time was no, because we're going to work together. One of the reasons the issue happened in Central San is that there was disconnect between the water board and what Central San is willing to do, and push come to shove, the water board finally played his card. Huh? Regional San, excuse me. But the point is, we forecasted the need to take action, more than a decade ago, and we've made a lot of progress with that. So the difference between what happened with in Sacramento versus where we're at today is that we've made a lot of progress. We've built a lot of trust. We have opportunity to adapt. But time is an issue because the Bay has demonstrated it's vulnerable, and having been exposed, particularly this species, it appears that it may be more vulnerable in the future as a result of it. So we have to be nimble. We want to work we will work together. I'm going to say we want to work together. We're going to work together, and we'll find ways to make sure that we don't make a regrettable decision at the local level and at the regional level. So, right, we're going to work together. There's too much at stake. We want to invest our money wisely, and that's why the board is going to express interest in multi-benefit solutions, because it's going to be a win-win-win. But we have to still deal with the regulatory constraints and a call to action because of concern with potential future algal blooms. So it's a tension that we can best manage by working together.
Thanks, Tom. Amit.
I was just going to add to what Tom, you were saying. There's no question there's call for action. We have to reduce nutrient loads to the bay. I mean, I'm not going to ever argue that against that. But the question is how much, if somebody asks, okay, what is the magic number, you know? I think I will quote Tom. He said 42. Oh, come on, that's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the
Hitchhiker's Guide.
Galaxy. Okay, but it's not a magic number. It's not a magic number. It's the best educated guess. And we have to work towards it. And we know the bay resiliency is probably shrinking. You know, we have seen the red algae coming twice in a row. I mean, not as significant as 2022. So that's telling us something. It's here. This thing is here and it's going to come up again. So we have to do our part. But the challenge is these kind of regional projects takes time. And we all have to do planning, regional coordinations to make sure we're not spending billions of dollars and not strategic about it. So there's a lot of collaboration involved and a lot of working together involved. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to be painful, but it's got to be done. So that's just wanted to add.
So I keep seeing a lot of hands shoot up, and I want to get to everybody. Sure, go ahead. Yep.
Hi there. Maybe I misheard or didn't hear, but Robert had said that there were 3 factors that, in general, make it so that the algal blooms do not occur: the suspended solid stratification, the clams, and the filtering, blah, blah. And then Richard gave his presentation, but, were those factors not present during that 2022 bloom and in the 2023? And are there trends in those factors that are negative that make these blooms more likely?
Well, we have Dave Sen here in case I misspeak, but there was sort of like a Goldilocks period, we don't exactly know. I mean, I'll just be honest. Like it's not like we know exactly why it happened, but we have some reasonable hypotheses that can explain it. So one of them is about mixing. So this organism has a flagellum, and so it can swim. And so that gives it an advantage where it can preferentially stay in the area where there's enough sunlight to allow it to do photosynthesis. And if there is the normal amount of mixing that happens in the bay, it can't keep up with the amount of mixing, so it gets mixed down anyway, despite its best efforts to stay in the photic zone. So one of the factors was this was a period of time that had relatively weak mixing. So its swimming ability was able to overcome the weak mixing, and it was able to kind of stay in the sweet spot longer than it normally would, and that condition kind of persisted for a long period of time. And that could explain also why the 2023 one happened and kind of got going a little bit. It was the same time of year, and this is the time of year where we are vulnerable to this kind of weak mixing regime. So that's one factor. The turbidity, there is a decreasing trend in turbidity in the bay that's kind of like a long-term process that has to do with the cessation of the turbidity pulse from the watersheds that had to do with like hydraulic mining and reservoir management. So there actually is less suspended sediment in the bay now than historically, so it's a little bit clearer, and that could be part of like this long-term trend of increasing chlorophyll A levels that we had seen. It kind of coincides with like this observation of the bay becoming less turbid. And then there's another factor about mixing that's independent of this sort of like weak tides, where they've noticed, like with climate change, this weird observation that wind speeds in certain parts of the bay are lower than the historical record. So there's sort of like that's another mixing factor. So there's at least like a couple of physical factors that were like the sweet spot for a long period of time that kind of allowed this thing to get some momentum. Did anything you want to add, David? Okay.
So, Jackie, was there a question? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to ask, given the changes that we're seeing and the potential for some reduced mixing on especially a sub-basin scale, what is your level of confidence that nitrogen will always remain the limiting nutrient to blooms across all the sub-basins? Or another way to put that is there any risk that you perceive of phosphorus becoming limiting on a sub-basin scale?
That's a good question. I actually just looked at this for like there's this long-term USGS record of these Polaris cruises that they cruise the spine of the bay. They've been doing it for like 40 or 50 years, and I did look at the nitrogen to phosphorus ratios for this question, and from what I remember, the southern part of the estuary, so like kind of like where it was like the ground zero for this algae bloom, it's pretty strongly nitrogen limited. But what I haven't run the calculations for, like if we get that reduced nitrogen level, do you get close to flipping it? And I think it was strongly enough nitrogen limited, like so that ratio is like 16:1, that it is like the flip over point, and it was pretty far away from that point. David, have you looked at that? Oh, have you looked at this question?
Yeah, I was just going to add some context. So I've been leading the nutrient trending report, and one thing that struck me historically is the phosphorus reductions across the plants are about 2/3 of the influent load is reduced. That's primarily attributed to a blend of metal salts used for odor control, coupled with a lot of these plants have anaerobic selectors, East Bay mud, Orloma used to, the list goes on, San Francisco. But one thing that resonated with me when Orloma pivoted over to nitrogen removal is now that selector that was historically used for phosphorus removal is now being used for nitrogen reduction. So it's something to just be aware of, that the loads for phosphorus, while they've historically been about 2/3 across a plant, they might creep up as plants make this shift. So your point's a really good one looking into the future.
Thanks. Now, maybe I misunderstood, but nutrients have been being looked at for a long time, like everybody said. And this bloom seems to have taken everyone by surprise somewhat. So my question is, the response of limiting nitrogen to limit oxygen disappearance, that's it's sound, but the fundamental understanding of what's going on out there, where's all this work on modeling being done, like to develop a stronger base understanding so we're not surprised, which I guess relates to these other questions of so we don't have to spend $10 more billion, but does it live at SFEI? Are you doing it? Where's all this work being done?
Yeah, it's being done through the nutrient management strategy, and so the scientists involved are mainly at SFEI, but not only. There are some other consultants that they get to help out with it, and we are trying very hard not to be surprised for the next time. But I can give you just like a quick answer. Like prior to the algae bloom in 2022, what we sort of noticed was chlorophyll A levels creeping up. We didn't really have algae blooms. We had a model, that model that I mentioned that produced the dissolved inorganic nitrogen field. That was the model that was developed. And also, it does have the capacity to have algae growth. but it was calibrated and validated against available data that didn't include a big bloom from, you know, San Francisco Bay. And it was sort of like the plain vanilla, you know, algae growth that you get every year, and it was able to match that really well. But then we get a bloom from an organism that's got this amazing feature of being able to swim, and it's, you know, it was kind of like it was not something that the model was developed to treat, because we were modeling sort of like this long-term pattern of algae production, and, you know, thinking that that was what we were needing in terms of making our management decisions. So the bloom was a surprise for us, and we did not have a model that could, you know, actually predict the Heterosigma kashiwo concentrations. That's why we took what it could do well, which is nitrogen, and then we took the results outside the model and employed that stoichiometry. What we would like to do now is, now that we kind of think that the channel of beneficial use harm is probably going to come from these kinds of catastrophic events, we want to have the ability to model that better. And so we are going to be working towards that. That's kind of, you know, long answer to your question. We're trying to get better at modeling exactly an event like this. We're not in a position to do that now, so we took the information that we did have some confidence in, the DIN, and applied stoichiometry that seemed to match the observations, like that I talked about, like the nitrogen was utilized and matched the amount that was produced. So those are sensible ways to proceed.
I'll just add, the unfortunate reality is, until we have HABs, it's hard to understand them. But when we have them, with our science program, we are now in a position to make substantial observations. We've made substantial observations. We've got a monitoring network that now is telling us that there's probably small-scale HABs happening much more often than we ever paid attention to. And we're going to enhance our observation network quickly. And as a result of that, we're going to at least start formulating understanding of what are the precursor conditions that we can observe that coincide with the HAB. And then we can start focusing on what controllable factors result in those conditions. So that's part of our next phase, that we're in a position, we got a platform of scientific knowledge, and now we're going to have to turn it up. And we're fortunate to have the likely benefit of federal funding to augment the local funding. So I have hope that we're going to be in a much better position to answer your question in the not too distant future.
We need a question for Lorian.
And I was actually going to grab a piece of that question, which was who's doing all this and where is it being done? So at previous nutrient presentations, we go back through the entire history, and we skipped all of that today, which perhaps we shouldn't have, in favor of talking more about the permit. But about in 2012, I guess it was, the nutrient management strategy was developed and established, which is a chartered governance process for guiding the science. It's under the umbrella of the Water Board. And the idea was it brings in stakeholders, basically any stakeholders who are involved in and interested in nutrient science. BACWA has 2 voting seats, but these are open meetings. They're 3 or 4 times a year. The next one's actually next Friday. And again, these are open meetings to get updates on the state of the science and provide feedback on where the funding should be spent and directing it. So I wanted to respond to that aspect, but great job in discussing how those decisions are being made.
So, more questions? Is that it? Really? Well, oh, Mike.
I had a question regarding the toxin released from the organism. Does that release typically just happen during the decay when it dies off, or is it why it's actively thriving and multiplying?
I don't know. David, do we know about the sort of like the toxin? Is it something like when the cells break open, or is it something like that it produces sort of like as a street fighting mechanism to further its dominance. Like, I don't know. Do you know?
I think it depends a lot on the organism.
Okay, but for this one, for heterosigma, do you know?
For heterosigma, I believe fish kills first started seeing them when oxygen levels were saturated throughout the system and when the organism was at its peak abundance. And so I would say that whatever toxic mechanism it exerted, it was exerting it actively while it was present, as opposed to only after it started tapering off.
I do remember one other thing now from like one of our interesting nutrient science meetings was that, and I don't know, I don't remember the organism, but well, I think it was a general observation about when you would see toxin production, and I mentioned like that kind of comment about street fighting mechanism, and they did see a correlation between like when you would have like nutrient stress. So like when this organism was stressed, but maybe not dead, that there would be sort of an increase in toxin production. And that kind of does go along with like a defensive mechanism. You want to make sure that you clear the field and like kill anything that could be competing with you for the nutrients. So that there has been some observation about that in terms of the production.
Thank you. Okay, so we can take one more question. If anybody's brave enough to. No? If not, we can break for lunch 2 minutes early. So we are going to take a full hour for lunch and networking, and that's going to be on the upper floor, and we'll start up again at 1:30.
Surprised at how technical and sciencey all the questions were. It's like, why didn't we think of it? No, you didn't need it. You didn't need it. I get it now. I didn't get it before. I got it now. So for our board, I said we have to do for our board meeting every person. Not all our board. Yeah, great job.
Question for the comments, and I received emails from you, but I don't have the email information.
What agency are you with?
Las Malinas Valley Sanitary District.
Right. You know, it's possible that we have this.
These are all emailers. Okay.
Put your email address in.
Sure.
Send.
If you know your stuff well enough,
Here.
there's always something.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You guys don't have a limit, right?
We don't have a limit, but we have a nutrient permit. Yes, yes. So, we never had the issue with nutrient removal, and but I'm just interested in the topic.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm
Thank you.
glad that you came.
Thank you.
And so I don't think we've met in person before.
Yeah.
Some of this stuff.
Fahad. Yeah. Nice to meet you.
guys are way
Thank you.
above where I am. If we made the bay deeper, it wouldn't matter. If we got a little deeper, in certain areas where the depth of the water.
Well, it's going to be deeper, right?
more impact.
With sea level rise.
Well, I know, but I mean, if because didn't we fill it in with silt and it's always keeps filling it? I don't know.
I looked into that.
If you just make it a little deeper, it's not gonna help. Like the only thing would be like the biggest.
Right, 25 feet average depth.
Especially so it would have to be significantly deeper.
So yeah, it's not worth it. It's not feasible.
No, it would have to be significantly deeper such that when the Dave, in this part.
Yeah.
Non-coded for a long period of time. But when you're just talking about a little bit, it's not.
Now, is there no natural enemy for this algae? Is there nothing that takes it other than our cleansing clams that are, you know,
So EV mud is actually one of the possibilities.
So zooplankton, like, so the way it works, like, zooplankton, but the thing is, like, they need to grow and make, you're not getting out there in big numbers can handle the food, so there's sort of predator prey interaction, and so then, like, the food becomes available, and then the zooplankton, like, has to get, grow and multiply to achieve a concentration where it can handle all the food. That's one issue. And then there could be a virus. So we're trying to understand, like, why did it crash? So because if you look at it, just fell off the table, it was all dead everywhere at the same time. So one hypothesis is that there was a virus that virus outbreak killed all. And we don't really know.
don't know what was it? Maybe it was the end of its life cycle, or not? Just like it freaking did. It's like a moth goes out, breeds, kills, and dies, like deer, right?
It could have probably kept going. Like so it could be. It could end because, like, imagine a big mixed event. We don't really know why. It could be a combination of everything caught up, but it wouldn't be bivalve. They were there the whole time doing the best they could, raising pressure. That achieving a high enough concentration that they eat it. Maybe not.
So in other places, there's things, for instance, the actual VO crash times on these organisms. So during the night, they photosynthesize and they'll go into extreme oxygen stress. And they'll start to have these die-offs, or sometimes they have almost chemical signals where they start shift, and there'll be another organism that comes up. They outcompete them, but not the same degree, and then suddenly, because they're everything when they're succeeding, that's when their nutrient stress is high too. So it's like it's sort of like the peak of the bloom is also when they finish these things, because that's also when nobody can get nutrients. There's so many of them out there, so they're like starving and thriving. But I was going to ask about the toxins. Have you guys looked at? It's okay in this case. Obviously, there was some impact of toxin, but you're assuming, all right, so we're going to prevent this organism from growing the same volume. Have you looked at historical? Is there any data on historical events? Because if it was something like a microcystis that has a much higher toxicity thing, how would you can't assume it's the same organism every year. Sometimes.
Right. So as Robert said, we're sort of forced in doing load reduction because there's beneficial use, and so that we took the information we had from the event that harmed beneficial use, but we have that is sort of another uncertainty, kind of like really fighting, like fighting the last war analogy, where we're facing the load reduction on critical condition of this particular condition. But remember, it's like it's dissolved oxygen. bloom, producing a bunch of biomass, and digestion of that biomass.
I think that mechanism's
doesn't matter.
That mechanism's clear, but you know, we were saying that there's some fish kills before the crash.
Right.
So there was some
So
impact.
that's, and as I said, here, that is an uncertainty. Like the scale of the load reduction following tunes to achieve that dissolved oxidation, and it will have some benefit for toxins because you've got less biomass, but we don't have a predictive of toxins, even for this one, not even bringing into consideration if it was a different organism with kind of different biology. That's an unknown, and this is, you know, we've got to look into these questions as we can to find. So right now we're kind of hanging our hat on dissolved oxygen, and we're basically taking credit for it's going to help toxins in some sense, but we can't guarantee that it
This number is way up.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like, you could take something like microcystic, you know, that has like the high acute toxicity for oxalates. And then we also know very well around the world as well that microcystic. Well, I don't actually know how to do that. Like having this part of work. So let's say like my operator in my house. Operators be like, you know, I just kind of wanted to be a scientist and they quite make me there. Then I fell into wastewater, and then the science kind of like, right, yeah. Yeah, and then one of them, not that we should do it, like, what are the risks that in 5 years there's a blue on the side, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, as I said, the wise national program.
But I go, there's a level that you always kind of wanted to get to, and I don't know if I'll ever get that.
No, I mean, hopefully we have no more risks ever.
And then when you get into discussions with people, because I have people within my family that are, you know, they don't believe in climate change, and they don't.
Sure, and I don't think I
They hear
know.
all the money we toss out, that they get all weird about it, right?
joined
Well, then I have a defense. And I'm like, oh, here's my set. Let me just show you this goddamn crap. Okay? You guys are all full.
Oh, okay, yeah, say hi back.
Thanks.
She's a friend of mine.
Yeah, this is super interesting. I mean, I'm a Southern California person, and but I'm
It looks good, my, you know,
and it's really interesting to hear this because I didn't realize it was so eminent, but from Karen's presentation, basically saying next in your house.
And it's still gonna take a while, it's not gonna be like a next permits, but yes, it's coming, so.
Well, it's nice to meet you. Thanks.
I'm gonna come back, and I'm just concerned. I'm not concerned about. Are you gonna? When did we start at the 1:30? Okay. That was fun there. It was like I enjoyed the. Yeah, there's a question. By the way, Taylor. Doing it.